Tonight, high stakes at high prices.
I'm dipping in savings so that I can live.
Skyrocketing inflation meets downward pressure on the economy. Plus, the Southern Baptist Church scandal.
Sexual predators have used our decentralized polity to try to turn our churches into a hunting ground.
Face to face with a new president. And on Juneteenth,
it represents the day, June 19th, 1865, when enslaved people in Texas first learned of their emancipation.
Marking the beginning of progress in the civil rights movement. All this and more on Faith Nation. Hello, everyone. Tonight, a delicate gun reform deal on the Hill. Well, it hangs in the balance. Welcome to Faith Nation, folks. I'm George Thomas. On the heels of a shooting just this weekend at a music festival in Washington celebrating Juneteenth, a framework over gun reform is hanging over the halls of Congress. Now, lawmakers are set to iron out the details of a new gun reform deal this week, even as Republicans and Democrats return from a holiday weekend that saw deadly gun violence around the country. Our CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka has the story from our nation's capital.
A Juneteenth celebration here at 14th and U Street in Washington, D.C. ended in tragedy on Sunday night. A teenager was shot and killed and others injured.
Right before the shooting occurred, our officers recovered a firearm, an illegal firearm, right here in the 1400 block of U Street. And shortly before I walked down here, our officers recovered another illegal firearm down in the 1400 block of T Street and was chasing another person with a legal firearm in the area. So, I mean, I think, you know, there's a theme that you see here. Illegal firearms in the hands of people who should not have them make events like this unsafe for people who just want to enjoy the beautiful weather.
The chaos erupting at what police call an unpermitted event called Mochella celebrating Juneteenth. The result, a 15-year-old killed, a D.C. police officer, and 2 other adults wounded.
Police responded to numerous reports of people shot at East 139th Street and 5th Avenue.
In New York, 9 people were shot and 1 killed in a mass shooting in Harlem. These deadly shootings are just the latest in a string that started with a church shooting in Alabama Thursday. 3 senior citizens died there.
Gunshots rang out. I didn't realize it was gunshots. And a lot of people dived for the floor. I dived for the floor, and when I got down there, I realized that 2 of my girlfriends who had been sitting at the table with me had been hit.
In the background of this ongoing violence, negotiations continue on Capitol Hill, trying to make progress on gun reforms. Texas Senator John Cornyn took the lead on negotiations for Republicans, but he was met with boos in his home state at the Texas Republican Convention. Still, he tried to make the case for the bipartisan deal.
So you might ask, what is on the table? More mental health resources, more support for our schools, and making sure that violent criminals and the mentally ill cannot buy a firearm. That primarily means enforcing current law.
President Joe Biden said over the weekend he's ready for a bill to hit his desk.
I am happy with progress. I'm prepared to sign it, and I'm ready to go.
That bill is not written yet, but a deal was reportedly being worked on all weekend. Some of those hang-ups include funding for states to implement red flag laws and something called the boyfriend loophole, which prohibits a domestic abuser from being able to buy a gun. It will be very tough to get the bill into writing and passed before Congress goes on the 4th of July holiday break next week. In Washington, D.C., Matt Galka, CBN News.
Thank you, Matt. On the economic front, runaway inflation is continuing to take its toll. Americans are cutting back on spending, and credit card debt has reached all-time highs. Almost half of the economists surveyed say recession is likely in the next 12 months. The administration disagrees, saying it's not inevitable. My colleague Dale Hurd has the details.
With inflation now at 8.6% and food prices rising the fastest in 40 years, Americans are trying to find ways to get by, and that means less spending.
It's really kind of tough, you know, because you want to have everything provided, but everything is so high.
I'm dipping in savings so that I can live.
Credit card debt, which dipped during the pandemic as Americans used government stimulus checks to pay down balances, has rebounded to all-time highs. As Americans tighten their belts and close their pocketbooks, it puts even more downward pressure on the economy, pushing it toward recession. Almost half of economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal say a recession is likely in the next 12 months. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen still insists a recession is not inevitable.
Clearly, inflation is unacceptably high. It's President Biden's top priority to bring it down.
But retail sales slowed last month for the first time this year, including a 4% drop in car sales. Americans have begun pulling back on spending, especially on services rather than goods. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers says all signs point to a recession.
The dominant probability would be that by the end of next year, we would be seeing a recession in the American economy.
Record fuel prices are another major inflationary pressure reverberating through the economy. While Yellen says the administration would consider suspending the federal gas tax, about 18 cents a gallon, that would not make a huge difference.
Next time you go to the grocery store, the hardware store, you buy something online, you're going to pay for it. Or I should say you're going to pay much more for it, given the fact that diesel prices now are approaching $6 a gallon for a national average.
But the biggest reason by far for inflation, according to analyst Joel Griffith, has been runaway government spending.
Look, we spent around $6 trillion extra over the past 2 years than we normally spent, and nearly every last dollar of that was printed by the Fed and used to purchase government debt. That's why we have inflation right now.
One thing economists seem to agree on, there will be no easy way out of this economic mess. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
In medical news, the CDC has given the green light for infants and young children to get a COVID vaccine. Nearly 20 million as young as 6 months to 5 years can start their vaccinations this week. The CDC signed off on it over the weekend. There are two choices here. Pfizer's 3-shot course, which each 1/10 of the adult dose administered over 11 weeks. Moderna offers a 2-shot regimen equal to 1/4 of the adult dose, spread 1 month apart. While kids are less likely to face severe illness, parents are being urged to get them vaccinated as soon as possible. Well, our very own CBN medical reporter Laurie Johnson joins me now with more on this to expand this information. So what should parents of this particular age group know about the vaccine?
Well, the big takeaway, George, for parents of children between 6 months and 5 years old is it really would be worth your time and effort to give your pediatrician a call. Because people who have children between 6 months and 5 years old are in pretty regular contact with their pediatrician. As children get older, they see the pediatrician less and less. But the young ones, they're usually in pretty regular contact with the doctor and often talk about vaccines. So what you're likely to talk to your pediatrician about is, number one, does my child need this vaccine? And if so, which one? If a parent wants their child to be vaccinated by school time or by the expected fall increase in COVID cases, they might want to think about getting their child vaccinated soon, because for the Pfizer vaccine, which is 3 shots, it takes about 4 months for a child to be fully immunized. What the pediatrician is most likely going to tell you is that although it's very rare for a child to have a very serious case of COVID, it does happen. 200,000 children have been hospitalized for COVID, and George, 200 children have died from COVID. The CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, thinks every child over the age of 6 months should get the vaccine. Parents don't necessarily agree. Only 1 in 5 in this age group say that they're going to do it.
Yeah, interesting. A quick question here regarding the origins of the pandemic. Interesting, a new claim from an unnamed European politician has World Health Organization Chief Tedros saying he believes that it was actually, that a lab leak was the origins of this, even though he has publicly said he's not quite sure. Meanwhile, Dr. Fauci says it went from a bat to humans. Any new evidence to expand on that?
Unfortunately, not any new evidence, but that's kind of big news that the WHO director said privately off the record that he thinks it was a lab leak. We do hear that people who are very reputable, the former CDC director Robert Redfield, absolutely thinks that it was a lab leak. We know that Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, believes that 100%, but there is no smoking gun on either side of the issue. There's no proof. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but there's no proof that it was a lab leak, and also no proof that it went from the bats to the humans. And we sometimes wonder if we will ever know the truth.
Okay, really quickly, last 30 seconds. We're seeing COVID cases rising across the country. Fortunately, the death rate is not good news, right?
Yes, the death rate right now is as low as it's been throughout the pandemic, and we are in a surge right now. I know so many people who have gotten COVID recently, but the good news is that most Americans have immunity, and so the cases are mild. We're seeing about 300 deaths a day. That's pretty low, but it's still about twice as many deaths as we see every day from suicide and car accidents. We want to get that death number lower, but it's still 10 times lower than it was at the peak.
Lori, as always, such a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And explaining this. You're most welcome. Folks, today on World Refugee Day, we mark a grim milestone. As all across our world, an astounding 100 million people have been displaced. Get this, since May 2022. The U.S. is the largest single provider of humanitarian assistance worldwide, and this year raised the annual refugee admission gap to 125,000. The U.S. welcoming more than 80,000 Afghans over the past year and providing temporary safe haven to tens of thousands of Ukrainians. President Biden, by the way, commemorating this day, adding in a statement that as Americans, protecting and welcoming refugees is part of who we are. This as NATO Secretary General warns Russia's war in Ukraine could go on for years, and that the West should be prepared to continue supporting Ukrainian defenders. Jens Stoltenberg said the long-term costs may be high, but the risk of letting Russia achieve a military victory is a greater gamble. The NATO chief also called for more weapons to Ukraine to help liberate eastern territories from Russian forces. A major sex abuse scandal now. A new president is faced with cleaning up the Southern Baptist Church. Coming up, the work ahead. Welcome back. Tonight, Americans' belief in God is at a new low. According to a new Gallup poll, only 81% of Americans believe in God. That's down from 87% in 2017. Only 4 in 10 believe God can intervene on people's behalf. The stock poll comes amid a major sexual abuse scandal that's rocking the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, a new SBC president is blazing a different trail. As a small church pastor, social media pro, and leader at a historic moment for the convention, Heather Sells reports from Anaheim, California, on Pastor Bart Barber and his vision for his flock.
Barber did not mince words, calling predators wolves who are going after sheep in Southern Baptist churches.
Sexual predators have used our decentralized polity to try to turn our churches into a hunting ground.
And now Southern Baptists have signaled they're ready for reform.
It's time for Southern Baptists to realize how nimble and resilient our Baptist polity can be to put sexual predators on notice that Southern Baptist churches are a dangerous place for them.
At his first press conference, Barber cast a vision for taking on the predators while candidly acknowledging another denominational hazard, infighting.
Every way that I've served Southern Baptists has left scars. Every way that I've done it. Hey, good morning, everybody. Bart Barber.
Still, Barber is known for his relentless optimism that translates in person and online.
He's positive, he's encouraging. Bart just pulls out his phone and does videos every day.
Jared Wellman, the new executive committee chair, says Barber's compelling transparency could help unify the convention while creating a different model for leadership as someone deeply embedded in small church life.
I think you're seeing a shift culturally in the convention and culture where people are, some people even say more of a mini church movement, intimacy, things like that. And so I think that Bart resonates with a lot of this new generation of Southern Baptists.
The small church pastor has plans to scale back travel normally undertaken by presidents. He is committed to bringing divided Southern Baptists together.
Shooting back to try to own them does not solve the problem.
In a country worn down from a pandemic, politics, and mass shootings, he's adamant that there's never been a better time to share the gospel.
Barber's first priority is naming a new abuse task force. He's vowed to work quickly to build a diverse group that will recommend new reforms that Southern Baptists can consider. Reporting in Anaheim, Heather Sells, CBN News.
Thank you, Heather. Today, America stops to celebrate Juneteenth, the history behind that day and what it means today when we come back. Tonight, America is celebrating Juneteenth. Juneteenth is an annual celebration of the emancipation of Black people from slavery, a time to reflect on our history and what we can learn as a country about healing race relations. Brody Carter brings us a story.
The origins of Juneteenth date back to the Civil War, where some 750,000 soldiers died, either fighting for freedom or to preserve the institution of slavery. And Juneteenth was just the beginning of progress.
Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
We learn about the civil rights movement, but it gets reduced to Rosa Parks and the I Have a Dream speech and maybe the Civil Rights Act. And that's almost the basic idea that most people have around U.S. racial history.
New York Times bestselling author and Christian thinker Dr. Jamar Tisby says some of the most important race-related events have been omitted from American history, like Juneteenth. Most history books don't even mention the name, which is why he's on a mission, re-educating the public about the day freedom finally came to all Americans.
It represents the day, June 19th, 1865, when enslaved people in Texas first learned of their emancipation. Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army came to Texas and he issued General Order Number 3. And in that, he said, all enslaved people in Texas are free.
At that time, Texas was the farthest state west and the last to hear of freedom, more than 2 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. As news spread, the shock for the some 250,000 enslaved Texans quickly turned to celebration.
So as Black people celebrated their own emancipation in the United States, they looked to the Bible and the Old Testament as inspiration, as biblical justification and continuity between the liberation they experienced and then the liberation that was spoken of in the Bible.
Juneteenth combines the words June and 19th, but according to Tisby, it was originally referred to as Jubilee Day, a biblical reference to Leviticus 25, celebrating the Israelites' freedom from slavery in Egypt. Faith formed the foundation of what would become America's most recent federal holiday.
Because Black people, even after emancipation, were often segregated and weren't allowed to gather in many public spaces, many celebrations of Juneteenth occurred at churches.
They would have fireworks. It was almost a carnival-like environment and atmosphere. There were always ministers preaching about the importance of Juneteenth and the importance of freedom.
Yet the freedom given to Black Americans would become overshadowed and even replaced with the rise of race-based segregation known as the Jim Crow laws. Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, professor of history at Norfolk State University, says Juneteenth commemorations went underground as the Jim Crow era ruled for nearly a century.
In that era, you have lynchings, you have the rise of race-based segregation. For many who didn't want the Confederacy to lose, it was not a cause for celebration. It was not something they wanted to highlight. And for a long time, particularly in the Jim Crow era, the field of history was dominated by white men who looked at history from a certain perspective and would not have spent much time on something like Juneteenth.
However, Black Americans saw incredible progress from the Civil Rights Act in '64, the Voting Rights Act in '65, and the Fair Housing Act in '68, and yet Black people were still facing an uphill battle in this nation.
Why are Black people and other people of color still experiencing discrimination and inequality after the gains of the Civil Rights Movement?
As society, including historians, politicians, and religious leaders, seek to address the unanswered questions about race still lingering today, Dr. Tisby believes the church has an opportunity to lead and be an example in the 21st century.
I think the church could make incredible progress if we understand that racism is both individual and institutional. It's both interpersonal and systemic. We need to both change hearts and change policies. I think that's really the challenge for the church around race today.
As for Juneteenth, it's not only a day to learn about history and celebrate with food, friends, and family. It's also a day to commemorate, remember, and lament.
We have to embrace the pain, the shame, the anger, all of that collectively in order for us to be a single nation. And July 4th will have more meaning when Juneteenth becomes a part of how we tell that story about our freedoms in America.
We have every resource in the Holy Spirit to be able to do that, be able to look honestly at ourselves and our nation and say, we got it wrong. And in some ways, we're still getting it wrong. But that's okay. We don't have to be defined by our past. As a matter of fact, when we confess it and when we're truthful about it, that's when healing begins.
Dr. Tisby offers some concrete ways the church can be a guiding light in this fight for racial justice. First, by being aware of injustice. Second, by building community relationships with schools, organizations, churches, and people who are different from yourself. And thirdly, making a commitment to find solutions to problems that still plague people of color to this day, all based on the biblical mandate to love your neighbor as yourself. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Finally, tonight, cities all across our nation are celebrating Juneteenth. In New Jersey, Newark is commemorating June 19th by renaming Washington Park after Harriet Tubman, famous abolitionist, and conductor of the Underground Railroad. The mayor of Newark delivered a speech from the new Harriet Tubman Square. The city plans to unveil a monument of Tubman later this year, and created the Newark Arts and Education District, featuring galleries and parks that embrace cultural vibrancy. Fantastic. Well, folks, that is it for this edition of Faith Nation. I hope you'll join us again tomorrow. From all of us here from the headquarters of the Christian Broadcasting Network, good night.